Thank you, Susie. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I am Suzanne Griffith, Managing Principal and Founder of Vega Partners. We are a social impact consulting firm here in Chicago, but we work nationally. I am also in this role hosting as a board member of the Association of Consultants to Nonprofits. So we're happy to co-host this with Forefront. Thank you, Susie and Keith, for putting this all together. And Emily Taylor from ACN and the entire Nonprofit Relations Committee. So I will very quickly introduce you to our panelists today. We're going to try to keep this conversational. We have not very much time, believe it or not, especially when we have such knowledgeable people on this topic. And then we're going to dive right in. So joining us from Seattle is Trisha Lazar of Strategy Works. Here in Chicago, Mary Morton of the Morton Group, and as well as Dennis Johnson of Sort Soul Group. So with that introduction, guys, I'm gonna just try to frame this conversation a little bit. We got a number of questions from participants as they were registering, and it was really great. And so a couple key themes came from those questions. And we're going to try to, address some of the larger themes that came through. I'm looking down because I'm looking at my notes. So one of them is around, the concept of culture. How does an organization go about creating and sustaining an inclusive culture? A second, and we had a lot of questions around different technical or tactical pieces with this, is how do we make the work of equity, inclusion, and diversity effective within organizations? And third, and probably finally, this is a great segue to probably close it out, is what should organizations think about? What resources should they be tapping into, particularly as they might consider bringing on a consultant in this space? So I'm going to dive right in on the culture question. So there are a couple of things. One thing I want to say is that, our firm also works in a space around equity, inclusion, and diversity, and we get hit a lot with the notion that, particularly from board members, right? The mission of our organization is already rooted in, grounded in, working with historically disadvantaged communities, people of color, et cetera, et cetera. Why do we need to do anything else about diversity? It raises, this notion of around what is the personal versus the professional, right? The individual to the systemic, the very nature of that question. It also brings up issues in the boardroom, in the executive management room, around, are we really doing diversity because we happen to serve people who are of diverse backgrounds? And you find that there's some reticence in the organization. It can lead to friction amongst leaders within a group. And we struggle with then, how do you facilitate, supportive conversations? Where does allyship fit into that? Where does co-conspiratorship fit into that? How do we advance the work of equity, inclusion, and diversity in our space? So with all of that that I just threw on the wall there, I'm gonna kick it off with Mary, because she's like, working on lots of racial equity training today. So this might be top of mind for you, but where does an organization start, and what things do they need to think about as it relates to building a culture intentionally that is meant to be inclusive, equitable, and diverse?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much. Happy to be here, members of both Forefront and the Association to Consultants for Nonprofits. So a couple things I would say. And again, we're based in Chicago, but we're a national group, and so we've been doing this work in some pockets across the country, in particular the Pacific Northwest, for several years. And what we've learned over time is that there has to be a will, right, to do the work first and foremost, and that really does have to be with the leadership of the organization. It may not start there, but that is going to make the work successful. I know there's another question when people talk about sort of how do we keep the work moving and successful, there has to be a commitment to it from the very top down, although it may not start that way. Generally, people have conversations. It might be over lunch when we could have lunch together in an office. Things, particular incidents may come up that raise it. And what's most important is then what is done about it, and creating opportunities for people to talk about this work, maybe in a staff meeting, to talk about the work and to talk about the idea of doing the work. When you talked about, Suzanne, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those are very different things. And I know that also part of the title for today's work is around racial equity. And often what people will sometimes say, well, we really want to work on DEI work. And sometimes it's racial equity work. And sometimes it's diversity, racial equity, and inclusion work. And just the quick distinctions, diversity is really not much more than a picture about difference, right? And it's the one that people most often will focus on is race, when there are many other diversity indicators, right? It could be orientation, economics, all those diversity factors. Inclusion is, I have been invited to the party. Has anyone asked me to dance? As a staff person, have I been included? Are my ideas validated? Are they acknowledged? Do I feel like I can contribute? And of course, equity is the bottom line. When we think about equity, it is, do I have all the resources and the access that I need to be the most successful in this role? And so, first of all, an organization has to decide which one of those they're going to approach. Some groups will say, well, we want to work on DEI because while we think race is important, we're concerned about all the other systems of oppression, and we want to make sure they're addressed. As you all know who do this work, we can't talk about any of them and not talk about all of them because of the intersectionality. And so the idea that race sometimes is put forward is because race is still the #1 indicator of someone's success in this country. And that is why it will, and without racial equity, we will have no gender equity, we will have no LGBTQ equity, we will have no disability justice, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a broad conversation you have to have as an organization. You have to decide which lane you're going down and then figure out how you're going to approach the work and we have a very systematic way that we do that, but I want to stop there and throw it back to you, Suzanne.
Yeah, let's grab Dennis and Tricia in this conversation. So I want to invoke what we talked about in our small group a little while ago, which is the notion of justice, right? So all things justice and social justice is top of mind for us. But I also want to go back to, Mary, you've brought up the point that this work starts with commitment from leadership. So I would love, Dennis and Tricia, for you to also chime in on what else does it take for this work to start in an organization? And then specifically, Dennis, if you can comment on justice and the JEDI approach or framework that some people use when they approach this work. So let me start there with you, Dennis, and then Tricia will add.
Sure. So thanks, and thanks to join you all, and thanks to the panelists and Suzanne, you for kind of helping to moderate this. I would echo kind of what Mary said, and I think when I think about creating, sustaining inclusive culture, where to start, and I think it's oftentimes about, where is the catalyst? It can come from the top of the organization. It could come from consumers, stakeholders. It could come from somewhere in between. And I think it's an eye towards, okay, where's the catalyst coming from? And then are others rallying around that? And so for our work and what we see in our clients is that, is something transformational trying to happen? And our leaders, whether that's the board kind of governance structure or the formal leaders of the organization, or again, the stakeholder kind of consumer beneficiaries, who's really trying to kind of help push that transformation forward? And are others rallying around it, or they may be resisting it? So I think, Mary, you're on to, quite a bit there in the regards of, are people, is this a one-off, or are we really going on a journey? And I think if those that are going on a journey, then we try and really help them think about, okay, where does justice fit into that journey? And so you mentioned the JEDI framework, and just for those that maybe not be familiar with that, but JEDI, is the acronym for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And we really try and think about, where does power sit? And who is building power? How is power shared? And perhaps who is wielding power? And so when we think about justice and think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we would say, where's the power in the system, and how do we think about deconstructing that power in order to really advance some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives? So to me, it's really around looking at, you know, organizations that want and espouse to have systemic change. Are they really trying to identify where the power is currently sitting? And then how do we try to deconstruct that, or at least distribute it across these different stakeholder groups?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo exactly what I'm hearing here. Gosh, so much good stuff. What I have found, or what we have found with our clients, is that there is many times a lack of understanding of the process of how to move forward. There is always going to be the awareness that happens first, and then the analysis and action and accountability. And those are very, very distinct processes to move through. And one of the most important things is to go through that analysis process. What we have seen is that there is a resistance, or a not quite full understanding of the importance of the analysis work, and it can get uncomfortable. And so I think as a facilitator and as a consultant, to move the leadership through that. A lot of times leaders are really, really interested in going straight to action right after they're aware of something. And there's no work. The work is where the consultants are able to guide and lead through that process. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we're trying to teach.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to say, when you say analysis, is that similar to what we might consider the assessment process? Or something different?
I would say that the assessment process is the initial that leads to the awareness.
Right. Exactly.
Leads right to the first. The analysis is absolutely 100% the very first space that you move into. And it's also a really good litmus test, a really good way to understand the readiness of the organization. Because a lot of people are asking for help and they're really not clear on what they're asking for help. And so
that's exactly right. And they usually think they know a little bit more than they actually know about the work. So we find that as the assessment, we do a customized training. And we always say the work begins after the training. It's not in the training. People think, oh, we did the training, we're good. And that's not really, this is really when you're going to operationalize, right, these ideas and values, ideally. So, okay.
So I want to go back to something that I think, Dennis, you centered on, because we have a very specific question here around managing friction within an organization, particularly at the leadership level. And, you know, you raised the notion of a transformational catalyst, right? You raised the notion of power and understanding, you know, ownership, wielding, leveraging of power. So I would like to ask all of you, what does an organization do when there is hesitation by leadership to commit to this, perhaps in a actionable way, right? So we get the lip service, we've seen that often, but there's no follow up or follow through. And what happens, or what's a starting place when we're looking to have an honest conversation about decentering power or dominant culture in an organization? Don't be so quick to raise your hand.
Well, I'll start it, and I will say that, you know, I know these questions are fairly recent, but I would have to say that I have seen, certainly in the last 2 months, a significant change around interest level. And in fact, that's why many of us are so busy now. I jokingly say, well, folks just discovered racial equity work. I mean, that's, you know, and we've been working on these ideas and concepts for a very long time. I think there is something that's happening in the environment that is pushing people forward. And I think if you have, like any other kind of, I have a background in legislative work and policy. I think you get the folks together, you get someone who will speak on this, who will really be able to get the attention of leadership and make sure they understand why it's so important, and that it is widespread, that it is not just one or two people. What we often find and what we know is difficult is if you're a person of color working in an organization, people have come to you over the last several months and said, what should we do? That's not really their job. And so you need to look for some external support and let someone come in, do the analysis, do the assessment, however the work may be approached. But there has to be some understanding of someone other than, I would just say, people of color in an organization, that this work is critical. And I think once you have that, then you can move forward if there's some hesitancy. Although I have to say, in most cases, at least ones that we've experienced recently, that is not the concern. The concern more, Suzanne, is around not understanding that this is going to be a power shift, and that this will not be business as usual if you do the work in a deep and thoughtful manner, and that there will be discomfort. I think they don't know that necessarily initially, and that's okay. We talk about that, but I think that is the real deal, that you will not continue to do work. It won't be business as usual. And if it is, then this work won't be effective.
Thank you for that. So Mary, you're suggesting that, an external interlocutor, if you will, needs to push on this point and push it past awareness. We have a question in the chat, since you guys got into practitioners speak and technicality around analysis and assessment. So I want to address that. For the listening audience. So Tricia, but this also brings up this point, right, that I think you were getting at when you said, for whatever reason, there's new awareness, and certainly with what's trending in politics and economics and healthcare and all things American right now, there's great awareness being developed, right, led by Black Lives Matter. And now everyone seems to have jumped on the anti-racism bandwagon. So, but I think, Tricia, you were going somewhere when you brought up this notion of pushing past awareness to really doing the deep work of analysis before we get to understanding where action and accountability come into play. So maybe can we circle back to that for the audience, since we left them confused a little. So let's clarify that, and then we'll keep this moving on to some other questions.
Sure. Each one of those spaces really needs attention. Usually the awareness part is what we all experienced back in May, where it was just an in your face. You saw the reactionary, just all of the reactionary that was happening, not just nationwide, but worldwide. And the very first thing that in the way that our Western business works is that we identify a problem and then we immediately go to action. And that's going to be the very first thing that we saw it play out over and over again, about, like, you could literally check your watch as to how quickly people would put out, or an organization would put up their statement. We're against this. We're absolutely, it's so obvious that there was no analysis that was done. Where are we sitting as an organization? Have we reviewed our internal policies? Have we looked at how we conduct our business day to day on the inside? How are we going to make these changes that show how does the world know? How does our customers know? How do people know, by looking at us, that there is significant effort and intention in the practices that we're doing? That takes analysis. That's where Mary speaks a little bit about, sometimes it gets uncomfortable. None of us want to ever be uncomfortable, but that's where the important work comes from. That's where the real change comes from. And not until you really do that deep dive investigation inside in as and I really don't like saying in a safe space, because nobody can put somebody else in a safe space. They have to come up with that themselves. But to put it in such a way that has meaning, and that people are able to work through the personal on their own to come to a collective, then you can get to the action. These are the things that we need to change, whether it be hiring practices, whether it be the rewriting of job descriptions, that each job description down to the smallest part-time job has infused the action statement, the statement of intent that we have all, that the entire team has come up with collectively. In order to get buy-in, you have to have people participating in the process. And then you move to figuring out what it is that you need to change. Then you come to the action part. And the action part is making those policy changes. Not until then do you start working on your statement to the world. And it explains specifically how it is that you are going to forward, start moving your organization in this space. But another critical part of it is accountability. Who is going to hold this organization accountable? I tell you that it's not good enough that the people that you have as statements that are going to be holding you accountable, make sure that we are doing this, can't be the leadership on the inside. Leadership can't hold themselves accountable. There has to be, it's your the people that you work on behalf of, your constituents, your customers, your just the outside world. You're making a statement that says, this is what we found, this is how we're changing, these are the things that we want you to be holding us accountable for. That's how all of those pieces work together, and that's the process that a consultant can come in, because you need that outside approach to be able to keep that moving forward.
Thank you. Dennis, want to chime in here at all?
Sure, I got a few thoughts. One around the friction comment. Like, I think friction's great because then something's trying to happen. So I feel, and we feel, that we try and position and prepare clients for that constructive discourse, that constructive interaction, that conflict, that whatever's gonna, kind of emerge. Like, that's, I think, what we're trying to do, because that's when people have an opportunity to actually check their belief structures, think about how they're emotionally responding to something. Are they feeling a sense of belonging or not? And like, that's where I think people start to open up and become more aware. So in my view, friction's actually a good thing. And that might scare some people away, but that's what I think a skillful consultant, coach, facilitator can help host that space. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Arnie Mindell's work. He runs the Process Institute, I think out in Oregon or somewhere, but he wrote a book called Sitting in the Fire. There's not a better metaphor, in my opinion, for this work about just, it's gonna get difficult. And what I think we're trying to do, and what I hear Tricia saying, and I think Mary as well, is this work is around getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And that requires hearts and minds, kind of behaviors, belief structures, emotion, purpose. There's all kinds of rich stuff that is really personal that I think people have to go on this learning journey. It can't be a training event. It really needs to be a learning journey to try and help better understand how they show up, how they see the world, and how do we help shift some of the way they see the world.
I think a lot of organizations too, you can't go into an organization and assume that all of the leaders understand transformational leadership. There are many different styles out there, and that is where it starts getting very uncomfortable, because transformational leadership is based around learning about the people that you're working with and understanding how to transform and change the leadership style in order to be very inclusive. And not all leaders are going to understand that it's definitely a top down. Having a lot of leaders, I've seen a lot of leaders that are really uncomfortable with letting go of what they think the traditional space is that they hold. And that is such a dynamic shift in culture that those type of organizations tend to have a little more resistance to this process because of some of the individuals that just have a completely different leadership style. So this is completely new information of having an inclusive environment that is more equitable for everybody that is participating in the process.
I just want to just add a very specific example around assessment, because I don't want
Oh,
to
yeah.
that someone has asked about that. So when we go into an organization, an assessment is a way to take check the temperature, if you will, on the climate of the organization, to look at knowledge building opportunities for the staff. So questions may be, what do you know about this terminology? People often rate themselves a lot higher than they actually do, because everyone thinks they understand microaggressions because they've heard it many times, when actually they don't. So the assessment for us is really the first thing that we do in terms of crafting that and looking at documents, talking to people here or there. The assessment includes surveys, it includes interviews, it could include focus groups, it all depends on the budget. We want to make sure that everybody in the organization fills out a survey. You have to hear from everyone. You cannot just hear from the executive team. And then interviews, again, a representative sample of everyone in that organization. There's an assessment report written, and that is what we use to build on the training. After the training, then there's action planning. Right? That's again where the real work begins. Some small works, you come together, and those plans are adopted both by the staff more broadly, and ideally you're doing work with the board and staff if it's a nonprofit. Sometimes that's not the case, but so we want to take people where they are and move them along. It will be uncomfortable. Without any discomfort, there will not be any change. And just your piece about safe, we always say people want to be in a safe space. We're trying to create a brave space. We're trying to create a space, because if we're safe, we can just sit here with our arms folded. If we're brave, we're going to take some risk, and we're going to ask some questions that, oh my goodness, they may not fall as we intended, but it's really important that you take those steps forward.
So we're going to move on. Thank you for that, Mary. And we've got a question here from Julia about what is the role of the board in this process, which is a great segue because we got a number of questions. I want to get tactical now, and I hope Dennis rejoins us. I click myself out of Zoom calls all the time, so hopefully he can get back in. So let's get really tactical. Not only what is the board's role or what is an expectation of the board's role, but what about other auxiliary groups? So there could be an auxiliary board, generationally, right? There are different auxiliary boards. What is the role of staff? And I think the harder question, which we will not be fully able to answer in just this call, but what is the interplay, right, of these particular stakeholders? There he is. Okay, hold on. I want him to hear this question. Dennis.
Sorry.
Okay. It happens all the time.
So we're moving on to the tactical, and the question I'm posing, because we also got a question in the chat from Julia Burns, about what the board's role is. And I'm expanding that question to say, what is the role of other stakeholder groups within an organization? Board, auxiliary board, donors, employees, volunteers, and what is the interplay, right, around those things? We didn't really dig into the question around power and shifting power, but maybe this is an opportunity for you guys to start put some of that in there, right? Because as we think about the interplay of various stakeholder groups within an organization, what role do they each take on? And can we start with you, Dennis?
Sure, sorry. The power went out in my building, I think. There was a surge. I looked up and I went away.
Well, we had a tornado yesterday.
So the questions around power, boards, stakeholders,
What's the
I
role
guess.
of the board? And then what's the role of the board and other groups like that within an organization?
Yeah, I think the role of the board, we do a lot of governance work, and you've seen one board, there's different cultures within a board. What role do they play versus leading the organization versus the leader or leadership team? So I think this gets back to some of the assessment and analysis to figure out like what's going on. But I would say generally speaking with C3, C6, C4 boards, the board's responsibility is to set direction, and not tactical direction, but I would say more philosophical direction, like where are we going? So in the current events and the current environment and what's going on in the external world, we're trying to help coach boards to think, how are you responding? What's going on? How does this impact you? Are you having these conversations in the boardroom to really help the leader or the leadership team think about what we need to be doing differently? So I think, historically boards have set strategic plans that are like years into the future. I don't think that works anymore, quite honestly. I think, they have to be able to be more rapid response. And so boards have, I think, a strategy, orientation, or they should be having some type of constructive kind of inquiry around, helping to guide and help the organization think, but they also have a fiduciary responsibility, and that's just not monetary, in my opinion. That's also social impact. Mm-hmm. And so I say to boards, what's the return on the social impact your organization is having? Most board members go, I don't know what you're talking about. And so for me, I think of like what's going on in the world today, and as it relates to other stakeholder groups, are they actually having an impact? And I think that's a great place for board members to start having a conversation, because I think most of them are not attuned to the impact kind of conversation. And I think that's really where most boards and organizations have opportunities to grow, particularly in current events, to say, we may be serving people in our community, but how well are we serving them? And are we really making a difference? So I get back to the power kind of question, and I go, how are we deconstructing traditional kind of structures where perhaps the power is not being either distributed or it's being enacted in ways that are potentially, unintended negative consequences? I think boards and people, are doing good work, they have good intention, but oftentimes they don't realize that those good intentions can actually have negative consequences. And I think particularly in the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, that's what's happening, I think, oftentimes. I don't think it's malice. I think it's they think they're doing good, but they're really creating perhaps or perpetuating systemic kind of challenges in their organizations.
So I want to ask, what do you say to a board who says, but we're already doing it? Our mission is such, our leadership, our staff leadership, our executive team, the rest of our employees are already diverse. We don't have a DEI issue. What do you say to boards who are saying that? And there are lots of nonprofit boards saying that right now.
Is that question to me or the others?
Everybody.
I'll pause to let Mary, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think minimally, we can generally get organizations to do an assessment where it clearly indicates that is not the case. And if there's enough, and the other piece I would just say is that often staff are much further out on this issue than boards. So there's this uncomfortableness about appearing not to know what's happening by board. So while we think the board should be involved in the process, we know that we need to often do a different process with the board than the staff and then bring them together. There has to be at least one champion on the board who will push the fact that we absolutely minimally need to do the assessment. And if we can get them to do the assessment, it will absolutely indicate they have some concerns. And most boards are not as diverse as they would like to be. And this is part of the reason why. And so we try to bring all those different pieces together so that they understand if you want your board to look differently, and let me just say, when they say that, often what they want are folks who look different but think exactly like everyone else. If you want your board to really, be inclusive, then these are the steps you have to make. And funders, as a former funder, that's something we'd ask about. Does your board reflect the constituency you're serving? And when it doesn't, we're going to call them on it. And so there are many different endpoints, I would say, and I see Tricia shaking her head, that you can make or you can use to make the point that they need to do the work as well.
Trisha?
Yeah, I absolutely want to parrot exactly what you're saying, because we find exactly the same thing. There's a couple of terms that we see quite a bit. There's something called false consensus bias.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
automatically assume that everybody thinks exactly the way that you think.
Groupthink,
A lot
yeah.
of times in this situation, just simply asking the question, how did you come up with this? Did you ask your constituents? Did you ask the people that you're serving? Can I see that interview process that you asked? And they will 99% of the time not have any of that information, because there's just an automatic assumption that we're automatically doing it right. The other thing is the status quo bias, which is using what already is working. And when I say working, I mean because nobody is coming and pounding on my door and telling me it's not working, so it must be working. That you consider that to be the norm, because it's the status quo. And so a lot of that initial evaluation process is really just trying to deconstruct all of that.
So let's say an organization does have a champion on its board. Maybe there is some, initial awareness building that, we tend to be on the right side on these issues, but maybe there's a little work for us to do. And so the board then decides to create a task force, right? And maybe it's a hybrid task force that includes board members and staff. What are your thoughts about where that work, what makes a task force around equity, diversity, inclusion effective within the organizational context?
Trisha, did you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would say that it really is important that board understand they have a body of work and that the staff have a body of work. That's number one. Doesn't mean that they're not going to come together and share some mutual planning opportunities, but the board is a separate entity under this umbrella of this organization than the staff. And so that's really important. What we have seen, again, is doing something, having each individual group do their work and then bringing them together for a retreat where we still have separate sessions, but we still bring them in the room together so that they can hear from each other. There's often a divide between board and staff in any organization. It's sort of that us and them idea. And so we don't want to use this in any way to exacerbate that. In fact, this work can be used to help eliminate or decrease some of those kinds of concerns. But it does mean that people have to be honest, and that is the atmosphere that people will move forward in, and that concerns about repercussions, because this is what we'll hear often. I didn't want to say what I wanted to say because, the board was in the room, or I didn't want to say what I wanted to say because my supervisor was in the room. And so how do you address those kinds of concerns? Because that is about creating a space where people feel we can say say our piece, if you will, and it will not come back to us in some particular way. So those kinds of group agreements, and then follow through, and making sure that the leadership is really part of helping make this point, so that people don't get caught up in the positional authority in an organization. That really impacts how well people do around this work with regard to positional authority and what people think they can say.
One of the things that we really make sure of is that we have representation in all spaces where there's going to be a conversation going on, because we see quite a bit of that retaliation fear, whether it's correct or manifested. It is just in a hierarchical process. You're always going to get that type. And that's left over from us being called into the principal's office at school. So it's just inherent in our culture. So by having one of the people on our team present in these spaces, it allows and also one of the other things that we do is we really try to make sure that we have the right questions and prep those that are in leadership, that they are the ones that are not speaking. They're usually the first ones to talk in a space, and they need to learn to stop and to be quiet. And their job is to take notes and to listen.
That's right.
And if you can have another person in the room to parrot and reflect on what is being said, if you have probably a little more articulate words, being the third party that's in the space, you might be able to frame it the same intent and thought in a different words, but the whole point is that that person feels supported. They know a third person has heard them, and you have a tendency to get a little more authentic conversations going. A lot of the times when leadership starts getting uncomfortable, that's when they start talking, and you have to have the constant reminder, stop. This is not your space to talk. It's your space to listen. You have such an opportunity to listen. Let's take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you. So we have a question here about compensation, and it was a question that got submitted earlier as well. What's trending, if it is trending at all, in terms of compensating staff around participating in racial equity teams that are being established in organizations, or DEI task forces, et cetera, et cetera. I think if I'm interpreting this question in our chat correctly too, they're also getting at having to look at the entire equity framework of an organization's compensation. But let's tackle this first part around, because we seem to be trending, right? And so we've got to have DEI teams, staff board, intersection of that, et cetera. It is creating more work for people. Is there a trend towards, compensating financially your staff around participating in this work right now?
I'll just say that's not my experience. That what we try to always say to organizations is, one, people must have time to do this work during the work day. You cannot expect them to work early. You cannot expect them to work late. Some groups decide to meet over lunch because it's just an easier time for everyone, but that they have to be given time to do this work during the work day, because it is part of your work. It is not this appendage hanging out here and like, oh, now we got to do this. If that is how it is discussed, then that is how it will be viewed, and you will not be successful. And so I have not seen any occasions where people are being compensated specifically for being on the committee. If you're leading the committee, which we, by the way, think you should do in multiracial teams, then there is ideally some way to address that in your performance and in your, and maybe in the fact that you're being compensated. If you're the chair or the co-chairs of a committee, that might make a little bit more sense. But this idea of being a committee member and being compensated, that I have not seen that, but I'd love to know if anyone else has.
Yeah.
I haven't.
Dennis?
So I was just reading the chat. I think the question may have been around kind of for volunteers. So I agree with what Mary and Tricia and you, Suzanne, echoed around like paid staff. I do see in community-based work, grassroots work, where we're asking stakeholders, beneficiaries, consumers, clients to participate, and be voice of the organization that they're trying to serve. I think organizations have to think about, how do you remove barriers to entry? So do you compensate them? Do you provide transportation? Do you provide childcare? I think those are all just good practices that everyone should be doing, whether it's now or before now. But I think, as it relates to volunteers, they should be compensated.
Yeah, I think that's different. And I'm glad you made that clarification, because I was thinking of staff in an organization. Similarly, when we do fundraising and people want to have a stakeholder or consumer come in and do the speech, and I'm like, are you giving them a stipend? Are you working with them? It's a great opportunity for them, but you're raising money, right? With this person, they should be compensated for it. So I absolutely agree with you, Dennis. If it's a volunteer, you absolutely want to think about how you help them participate in a meaningful manner.
Yep.
Yeah, and I put it in the chat, but one of the things that our firm does as well is we have a couple of seminars that just help people to get onto the same page. So, with the top of this conversation, Mary took a pause to say, let's first, get some quick definitions out there, because we need to level set that we're all using the terms and mean the same thing. So I would offer up, Naomi, if I'm saying your name correctly, that can be part of, an initial step that helps to build awareness, and it can help to correct some myths and some assumptions, and go deeper in terms of what people really think they understand. There's another, so we just tackled the question from Megan about compensation as it relates to volunteers. Megan, can I get a thumbs up if we hit that, if you need us to say more on that, if you're on Zoom?
Yep, she's saying
Yep.
she's added.
Excellent. And here's a really, really good tactical question again from Naomi. She's on an auxiliary board trying to create an anti-racism working group. How do you get people who are different in different parts of the journey onto the same space or same page? Is there anything else that you guys would recommend? We've talked about assessments in terms of starting the work. We've talked about having at least one champion who can help drive this conversation, particularly with the intersection around leadership, both executive leadership perhaps, and board leadership. Some seminars, right, that kind of level sets, definitions, conversation, how to have the conversation. Anything else?
Something that we, go ahead. No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that it's really good to remember the power of invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And honest, heartfelt invitation. Many people of color or of any type of group that doesn't feel supported are not going to initially jump up and say, oh, you're doing this here, let me be a part of this. There is a culture of learning to keep your head down and to just plow through, and that is for safety, to keep yourself moving forward. And so if there is not thoughtful, meaningful invitation and request for participation from the group or from the leadership, that's where it needs to stem from.
Agreed. Any other thoughts on
Go
that?
ahead, Mary.
So, I think we've tackled this in a couple different ways, but very straightforward. One question that we received early on is, what are common barriers that prevent implementing strategies around equity, inclusion, diversity? So, in this conversation, we've talked about, I feel, the work that happens to initiate, right? To initiate how you begin as an organization to address these issues. But when you get to that point of implementing strategies, what are maybe some things that you guys see that are fairly common, and what remedy might you suggest for that? Dennis, can we start with you before your power goes out?
Sure, gladly. Yeah, two things come to mind. One is, great to have a strategy. Is it budgeted and resourced, right? I think a lot of organizations say, oh, we want to do this work. This is the plan. This is how we plan to execute. But if we really don't resource that work, it doesn't get done. I often say what gets budgeted gets done. So to me, I think one of the biggest things, any strategy, whether it's DEI or otherwise, if it's not budgeted, it doesn't tend to happen. So I'd say, you're really serious about this? What kind of money are you going to put behind it? Because no money, no mission. So that's number one. I think the second thing around common barriers and just thinking about implementation and going on this journey, you need to be agile. Things are going to change. People are going to, the question earlier about like, not everybody's on the same page to start. Well, I got to tell you, most people are not going to stay on the same page as they move along in a learning journey. I think so. How are you agile, and how do you help bring people along that maybe are not coming along? And how do you also ensure that some people aren't getting too far ahead because they're going to lose others behind? So I think that other piece around implementation really comes down to, how are we scanning, reviewing, and revising based on what we're learning, experiencing, and building knowledge around?
Great, thank you. Trisha, Mary, additional?
Trisha, did you want to add? Yeah.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I will just say that I think it's absolutely the resource issue. However, before we even get there, what I often find, and when I've talked to committees that have not worked well, is that there wasn't a clear understanding of how decisions would be made and then enacted that the committee comes up with, right? So people get together, they get excited, they're working on their plan, and they think because maybe they've come up with this idea that then it will just happen. And so it's important to have that set from the very beginning, that you're going to, in most cases, every organization is different, the committee's going to come up with some ideas, they're going to be bumped up to the executive team. You, in some cases, have an executive champion or liaison in the room who helps with that, carries the water on that with the committee. But then that is vetted and addressed at the senior level, so that, to Genesis' point, it's going to be resourced. Because if you don't put some money behind it, yes, it's not going to happen. But when we've seen a couple of committees not work as we would have liked, or as the committee would have liked, more importantly, it's because they felt we had all these great ideas and then nothing happened. And so that, I think, has to be a clear understanding as you start the committee work, is how will decisions be made and then bump to the next level so that they can be resourced.
We see that magical thinking also happen at the board level too, right?
Oh,
so, yeah. Right, commonly boards, go through all of the right steps. They've brought in a facilitator, they've had a board retreat on it, they form a committee, they've heard from staff, they come up with some great ideas, and it is no longer part of their work. The next meeting, the next committee, the next discussion, the next strategy session, a year later, it's sort of like, yeah, but we had a great plan, what happened? So it does not magically happen. Yeah, Trisha, I think you were gonna jump in here too.
Yeah, what just keeps coming back to my mind is the fourth part of the process is who's gonna hold us accountable. And a lot of times there, you get to the action part and then everybody goes, great, okay, we've got the plan and let's do it. And then nobody hears anything. And when there's no accountability that's been clearly defined or put into place, and for anybody to report back on what the progress is, sometimes it just kind of fades into the ether. So if during the process of putting this all together, everybody is also clearly defined, how will we know that we are effective? How are we going to let everyone that's been part of this huge inclusive process know, other than organically? And that doesn't work. It needs to be clearly defined. And so if you can put that in place and say, here's all of the actions that we have collectively found to be, this is going to be our plan moving forward. You can't stop there. You've got to say, okay, how will we know when this works? How are we going to notify people that we've accomplished the small pieces, not the giant piece? That's too much. What are the small steps that are going to tell everybody? If you can figure out that communication piece, that small incremental communication piece to the people that put the effort in the first place, will keep them inspired to participate, because they see, even if there's small little changes, even if it's just little tidbits of what's going on, people get inspired to be able to be part of a process that is moving. You're going to lose all of your excitement and buy-in if all communication stops. So that accountability part at the end, even if there hasn't been anything since the last time that we all got together and checked in, if you say that, that also can be inspiring for people to say, oh, well then let's continue. Let's figure out where that hiccup is, and let's keep moving forward. The biggest piece is keeping constant communication and transparency open through this entire process to keep people engaged.
Thank you. So in our last few minutes here, we got a super, we're all consultants, and we got a softball question that was submitted, which should be a fun segue for everyone who's still with us to just call us up, right? But the question is, what guidance or what resources, nope, wrong question. The question is, what guidance would you offer nonprofit organizations as they begin to think about identifying a consultant to work with their organization? And then let me layer in, I'm always curious in these conversations, particularly with practitioners on this discipline, where are you looking for resources, and where is your learning taking place at the moment right now? So maybe if you guys can give a shot at those two things. What are you reading or learning from right now? And what should a nonprofit organization be thinking about as they look to engage a consultant around equity, inclusion, and diversity?
I'll go quickly. We do regular lunch and learns on our team. So they used to be in person, now they're virtually. So we're usually reading a book of some sort, then discussing it, figuring out if there are ideas or concepts we want to put into our workshops. And so, for instance, yesterday morning, I was recommending to a for-profit that we're working with, Diversity Inc., which is a book by Pamela Newkirk out of NYU that is chock full of stats. And I think whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, it's going to be helpful to understand what some of these conversations have looked like at various levels in different organizations. And then in terms of figuring out if it's a good fit for you with a consultant, I think you have an RFP ideally, or some way to talk about the work that is uniform with many people, right? Sometimes people will say, well, we're thinking about this. Can you give us an idea? Yeah, it's a little more difficult to do that, but that you do an interview. And so sometimes it's surprising that organizations solely look at a proposal. I find that surprising. And I just think you have to really talk to the team that you're going to work with, or at least some of those folks, to see if there's a good fit. That would be my recommendation.
Awesome. Thank you. Was that you, Dennis? I'm trying to catch you, before the power goes out.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. I would echo what Mary said. I think of like alchemy is the word that comes to mind. It's like, does the client, we often see RFPs and it's like everything but the kitchen sink is in there. Like, oh my God, do they really know what they want? Or do they just want just transform us to make everything better? And I think,
take care of it.
I think sometimes it's like, you got to have a conversation to really understand, because clients who say, we know exactly what we want, this is how it has to be, I think like they probably don't, and they're probably not going to get good outcomes, in my opinion, or deliverables. So those scare me. So, when you're selecting a consultant, I think, engage them, have conversations, interview multiple consultants, because you want to find someone who's going to have the right fit for you. We ascribe to the Racial Equity, you asked about tools as well, things that we're reading or learning from. Racial Equity Institute is one, Racial Equity Tools is the other. Policy Link, if you're thinking about policy change, and great resources there. The Social Transformation Project from the Rockwood Leadership Institute is a great place if anybody's part of ATC. 2 thumbs up for them. So those are the groups that I tend to network with, and I'm a white guy, right? So I'm white, male, privileged man, and you might think, well, what the heck does he know about this? One of the things that I learned on our journey probably 5-7 years ago is it is helpful to have a biracial kind of consultant facilitator team in the front of the room to lead some of these conversations so that we're connecting at different levels, multi-gender, if they can be multi-orientation, even better. But like, how do you model the way? I think that's really key as well. So we always bring other consultants of color along the journey with us. And and learn from them and participate with them. And so I think there's, you know, many different things that organizations can do, but just be open and be receptive to different ways of doing the work than maybe you think you have to do the work.
Yep.
Great, thank you. And Trisha,
Well,
before
yeah, I know we're running out of time. I'm going to absolutely parrot exactly and support exactly that was said. The only thing that I can keep thinking that when we're asked that is that we say, if a consultant comes to you and tells you exactly what needs to be done and says that they know exactly what needs to be done in this situation, do not hire them. Every situation is different. You want a consultant that is going to be able to have tools available to explore. It's not, it's giving an organization tools, but it's also, I think in our work, it is that the consultant is of the understanding that you have all the answers inside you already. We are here to get you to work through the process of coming up with a very specific answer and solution that works for your company. And it looks completely different each time. So it's not cookie cutter.
Nope. That's very important.
Thank you, everybody. We are at time. I will add my 2 cents to this. One, don't pretend that you know more about this than you do when you're looking for a consultant. Just simply say, we're not sure where to start and we'd like to start.
Did we lose her?
Yeah, I think we may have.
Oh my God, I'm still here and we lost her.
Oh, my goodness. I have to jump off for another call in just a moment. I have like 30 seconds.
All right, I'm going to cross my fingers that Suzanne will be back with us momentarily, but just in case, I will go ahead and say to everyone,
Or
oh, Suzanne, are you there? Okay, still fingers crossed, but everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. To Trisha and Mary and Dennis, your expertise has been incredibly valuable. I'm going to drop into the chat the link to the Ask a Consultant series if folks are interested in other topics we've covered before and to register for future conversations. I think Suzanne might be back, so I'm going to hand it back to her and say thank you again to everyone.
Bye, guys. I don't know how much you missed, but that was my internet, not Dennis's. No, I thank you, Susie. So yes, safe to chat. I don't know if you guys heard me say that. So there are really great questions that I also think you should pose within your organization. So thanks for having us. You know, I thought we'd have enough time to recap, but there was great things around, you know, that came out around really having to first take a look at, you know, what is the culture of your organization and be intentional about the culture you're looking to create. And then be willing to do the very deep, iterative, you know, uncomfortable work if you are committed to this. And finally, facilitators, as you heard, in lots of different ways, can be really essential to how you go about this work and make sure that it's meaningful until you build some capacity to sort of take it on for yourself. So with that, thanks for having us and being so active in your participation, and join us for our next Ask a Consultant. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.